Hey YouTube, Awesome Writer here. Welcome to another installment in my Sentai 50th anniversary video series. If this is your first time here, welcome. But also the way this works is kind of more of a retrospective of my experience than a formal review. I will be discussing my thoughts on the show and possibly some details on certain characters and stories if it pertains to my experience, but it's kind of more of a look back, walk down memory lane at my experience with the show. First looking at my memories with the show, how I watched it, what the experience was like, was it a backlog, did I watch it live, then my overall thoughts on the show, concluding by adding it to my Sentai tier list where I will have all of them tiered up by the end of this, ending with Boom Boonger, possibly gozyuger by the end of this, who knows, we'll see. So, Dairanger. Dairanger now, this will be the first more positive look back I have. I don't think I was overly negative in Dairanger and Jetman, like I tried not to come at it from a point of view like when I think about Hotaro. But this is the first series out of the three I've covered so far that I genuinely like more. I softened on Dairanger like I said. I don't hate Jetman, was disappointed by it, but I really quite liked Dairanger. Now, Dairanger is an interesting one. If you remember back in my Jetman video, if you watched that, if you didn't, how are you gonna even understand the lore? The substance. That was some lore. You wouldn't know that if you didn't watch the video. I talked about how when I first discovered, the world of Sentai, when I opened up to a larger world, some of the first things I saw was actually the Dairangers, which I always had this special mythology and kind of attachment around them because it was almost like a look into another world, a mirror world where we almost got that. It was a different feeling than seeing like Jetman or Liveman or Go Ranger or whatever, where it was just completely stuff from before times. But this was like stuff we got, we just didn't get those suits. So I always just was kind of drawn to them. Not to mention I really like the suits. I think they're really cool, especially the helmets. So I was always really eager to get to this series. And as I mentioned in the other previous videos, or which you would know if you watched them, and I know you didn't, when I first started Sentai, I sampled a bunch of different series. This was one I don't remember being available when I first started Sentai in regards to subbed episodes. Maybe there was one episode, but they didn't have like a batch of 6 or so episodes like Super Ranger or Mega Ranger, or it didn't have full series like Hurricaneger. So it was a while before I saw this. In fact, I don't think I saw any chunks of it until I decided to watch it. I think this was one of the last ones we did for book club with RRR, and I enjoyed this one so much more. And I really wanted to like it, and I was going in with a much more positive attitude. I would say, which I'll get to at the end, I was maybe a little let down just because of my own expectations rather than overhyped like in Jetman, but I still really liked it. Much like with Dairanger, I really like the mythology and world building. In particular, like very early on, they lay down a lot about the interesting world it takes place in, and then it's seeded throughout, but I really do appreciate the world they crafted here, and just the general feel and tone of the mythology. But probably my favorite thing they did is, in addition to having the kind of overarching story of the series, each character has their own storyline as well. One of my complaints about Dairanger is I didn't get to know the characters at all. And so this was a great way to get to know characters because most episodes didn't even necessarily feel like filler. I mean, sure, there was filler episodes, but by that I mean is there was always a place you could go. Like you could be doing a main plot episode, you could be doing a Red Ranger's episode about his rivalry, you could be doing an episode about Blue Ranger and those silly 3 villains. And so it always felt like you had a direction to go. It's part of the reason I love Generation 3 and 4's Pokemon anime, because you don't just have Ash's badge episodes or a filler. Now you had contest episodes to break up the minutia. And yet now I kind of miss it. Although Horizons kind of slaps. So, point is, I like that because not only did it make it more entertaining because I felt like there was always something going on, but I felt like I actually got to know the characters. That was one of my favorite things. They each had their own storyline. Kakuranger does that a bit too, which we'll get into next week or whenever it happens. But I really like that. You had the main plot and then each individual character plot. It made the series feel varied and it made you feel like you got to know the characters. I will say, I'm not a big fan of the Ko character. They did the Kid Ranger thing first before we did it in Turbo. I think I might even like Justin more than Ko. He was just kind of a perverted little kid that skateboarded and looked up skirts. Like, I wasn't a fan. It did make me look back at how funny it is that some of the over-exaggerated, motions of the suit are for Tommy and, how they tried to make that work. And, you don't even notice that stuff when you're a kid, and that's just kind of funny to think about. But I wasn't a fan of his character. There was some interesting stuff about the mythology with him and how he tied into the villains and stuff. But as a character, what a waste of a cool suit on literally just a twerp, even more than a normal Red Ranger, just a twerp. Interesting thing about experiencing this series is at the midway point between getting to experience a Sentai totally fresh, like anything before Dairanger, or anything new you're watching, because usually when you get into Sentai watching Geki Ranger, Go Ranger, King Ranger, whatever you're watching, obviously King Ranger, we're not doing Power Rangers, but you know what I mean. During that time, when I watched the Sentai live, we hadn't gotten PR yet, so that's totally fresh, and then everything else in between, with the exception of this, was very familiar. You'd be familiar with the footage, especially with series where you might have rewatched a lot, rewatched a lot of In Space, you're going to recognize a lot of Mega Ranger footage, so on and so forth. So that's kind of a familiar spot where you're going to recognize beat for beat stuff. Even in Mega Ranger, I didn't know that we just copied the Cassie's grandma episode, so Dairanger Dairanger is an interesting midway point where you're only familiar with half the footage, which is the Zord footage, and then the wacky footage of I'm summoning the Tiger Zord, deal with this footage, America. The rest of it is all kind of fresh stuff with the suits. That's why I said it's an interesting Elseworlds experience where you feel like you're seeing the other side of the mirror. So it was really fascinating that all the suit footage and stuff outside of White Ranger stuff was totally fresh, but I still recognized a lot of the Zord footage and monsters and stuff like that. Like, I remember in particular, like, stuff got real during Rocky Just Wants to Have Fun. Like, that's a memorable MMPR filler episode, but that was like a serious 1 or 2-parter arc where stuff got real, which is just really funny. So that was a really interesting experience, because usually when you're watching a series we did in PR, if it's a filler or it's a plot episode, it lines up. But that's the time I remember, I think we turned that entirely into a filler episode, and like, that was a significant episode in Dairanger. Last thing I want to say about Dairanger is one of the things I find the most memorable is the very weird ending. Kind of like with Jetman, again, if you haven't watched it, maybe leave spoilers for an old series. Again, it's no longer a secret, it's information. But there's like a weird ending where like everyone turns into mud people and the villain's side, and you're like, who is mud, who is real? And then they have like a weird flash forward. It's one of the strangest Sentai endings. In fact, off the top of my head, of all the Sentai I've seen, which is most of Zyuranger through present, it's the strangest Sentai ending I've ever seen. I think about it at least a few times a year, not in like a Twin Peaks ending way where you're thinking about what it all meant, but just remembering how weird it was. And it stuck out because, this is true now too, but back when I started Toku, Sentai usually has the tie everything in a bow ending, and Rider was usually ones that had the weird endings. Not quite this weird in this way, but Rider usually left things more up in the air or had a very just odd ending that would leave you thinking about it, whereas Sentai usually was kind of like happily ever after. So it was weird to have a Sentai ending actually feel like a Rider ending where it felt more oddball. I think nowadays Rider has more tied up in a bow endings, but at least back then it was more known. Like Sentai normal endings, Rider maybe a strange ending or unconventional ending. So it was very refreshing to have. So Dairanger, this was a series I had a much more positive experience with. I was so excited to go into this one. I was really hoping to like it more, like become a favorite just because I love the suits and was so hyped for it. But I wound up liking it only okay. I really do like it. It was a breath of fresh air from Zyuranger, actually having more of a serialized feel since you had individual storylines in addition to overall. But I'll admit, I just didn't latch onto it as much as I would have wanted to. Like, I wasn't invested in all the side storylines. Like, I wasn't huge on the Blue Ranger story with those 3 characters, whatever. It was amusing, but I just didn't get into it as much as I wanted. Even though I liked the weird ending, I felt it made things a bit muddled and confusing, no pun intended, when everyone turned into the substance. Boom! 2 of them in this review. I still do like this series, so for the tier list, I'm going to put this one on the B tier. Solid series for me. It's just one that I didn't connect with as much. But anyways, guys, let me know your thoughts and experiences with Dairanger in the comments. Until next time, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and climb the steps and ring that bell to get notifications for more videos like this and more. Dawson Ryder, signing out.